The Misfits.
Hey everybody, welcome back to a non-holiday edition of Is It Pagan?
It was only a matter of time before we started hitting things that weren't holiday-centric.
I mean, it's a non-holiday, but it is still answering the Is It Pagan question just in a little bit of a different way. So, Joe and I are together again because, why wouldn't we be at this point? And we are going to address some, not concerns, misconceptions maybe would be the better word, for what both of us where both of us kind of sit when we start talking about harmatology and sin. There is some misconceptions about what we believe and what we think about it and what we think about other people with it and all this other stuff. So we're just going to lay it all out now. And we're doing it as an Is It Pagan because unfortunately the misconceptions on all sides is that anybody that doesn't say things the right way is coming from a paganist mindset, or an agnostic mindset, or an atheist mindset, or whatever. And so that's what we're going to deal with today, is that. Right. But before we get there, we're going to let Joe, because he says it better than I do, we're going to let Joe kind of explain what the misconception is as far as what people think that we are saying regarding all this stuff, as opposed to what we actually are going to say for the rest of this episode.
Yeah, so this was kind of brought directly to the surface when this past 2 weeks ago now, I did a live stream with our brothers in the network on accountability and what it means to call out sin and all of that kind of stuff. And I said to Ant before we even went live, I was like, dude, it's gonna come across like people are gonna think like I'm soft on sin when you start to hear me talk about it in relation to the way that you guys talk about it or the average person talks about it. It's gonna happen. I'm telling you right now. I'm gonna be the odd man out because it happens almost consistently every time that sin comes up or discipline comes up or what it means to treat somebody as an unbeliever or what it means to where we draw the line on partnering with people who are in sin or any of the adjacent conversations. And so in a nutshell, in the West, when you come to the topic of sin and issues like that and how we as Christians should operate around those, and you don't come hardcore leading with your big stick that says like this is the truth, and if you do not fall in line with this truth, I'm going to hit you with this big stick, then you come across as soft. And you come across as somebody who is complacent or willing to overlook sin in order to, get somebody into the club, so to speak, and that sort of thing. And it creates this weird barrier where nothing else about why it's coming across like that, nothing else about your actual position gets processed, all just that you aren't saying the things that check the immediate boxes of what culture dictates you should say as somebody who is, plays by a different playbook or identifies as a Christian or something along those lines.
Well, I want to actually pull one thing out you just said here, because part of what you just said there at the end is what culture is telling you to say is sinful.
Yeah.
When we say that, this is one of the things that makes it kind of ironic when we start going through this, is that one of the things that we get accused of occasionally is that, well, we are just caving to the culture and not calling something sin.
Yeah.
But part of what we are going to start breaking down here is what we are actually saying is that the theological culture of this sect of Christianity specifically that normally gets mad at us, which is not just evangelicalism, it's not just fundamentalism, it's not even necessarily just an American, it is a specific style of Western theology that doesn't even have necessarily a label that is easy to put on it. But it's one that we addressed when Joe was on Misfits a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about fear as well.
Yeah.
Because it is a culture, is a theological culture that is almost more fear-driven than it is love-driven or Christocentric driven or kingdom-driven or anything else.
One of the paradigm shifts, real quick, but because you hit it, but I want to kind of clear away the brush a little bit for the listeners. The longer that you spend teaching the Bible or theology, studying history, the Bible, theology, biblical canon, all of these things, and you see the historical elements of how humans have interacted with this concept of religion, this idea of we worship a God who sent his son, who paid a sacrifice for us, and all of that, and how all of that shakes out, you realize that there are some through lines that encompass multiple groups of people. Some things that we talk about, some things that we have talked about at nauseum, with just the times that I've been on, let alone with any of the other rotating voices, that you can say it's this group that identifies this way, it's this period of time, you can pinpoint it a lot easier. This is something different because it tickles the brain of the human. It's pervasive specifically because of human nature. We talked about the last time that I was on, and don't get it twisted, guys. I'm on here again because I'm still campaigning to get myself on the logo. So hashtag put Bluebeard on the logo. I'm just saying. So when I was on the last time, we talked about fear-based theology. We started getting into that topic. And when you start talking about things that are innate to the humans in general wrestle with fear. Humans in general wrestle with what they do not understand or what they do not see. Humans in general wrestle with their own survival instincts. And when I say survival instincts, I mean you are coming against me because you have a different thought process, or you're doing something different, or you're acting in a way that I deem inappropriate, and out of my survival, out of the survival of my way of life, out of the survival of my moralistic structure, I'm going to come against what it is that you're doing. And in our world, in the world of Christianity, the direct path is to call that sin. Now, I understand exactly what I just did in the last 5 minutes. I threw a lot of people under the bus. I don't mean to, because Andrew can sit here and tell you for the next hour all of the ways that in our working together over the last 2.5 years, I have changed in how I've approached others, how I've approached playing in the sandbox, how I've approached being able to cooperate with the saints, understand that there's a plurality of expressions of worship, understanding that sin in relation to God, in relation to all of this stuff is all like it's so much more complex than just sitting there from my perch saying, I believe this, and if you do not believe like I believe, then get away from me, you heathen. You know what I mean? So this is an inclusive conversation, not us sniping at our brothers and sisters.
And that's exactly why we're doing this, is because part of what this little intro thing is saying is that these are the conversations that we normally get thrown into, as far as where we are the ones being sniped at. We're doing this conversation to say we don't need to be sniping at each other.
Right.
Because part of what we're going to get to is that like Joe said, the culture, the theological culture that this conversation comes out of is the one that is causing there to be the divisions and the fear and everything else.
Yeah.
And if we can get past that and actually look at what Scripture is saying as far as how we as believers look at this idea of what sin is, then we won't be sniping at each other anymore. Instead, it's going to be a place where we can all now fellowship together, actually.
Yeah.
So, we're going to start by, Joe, you're lucky my buzzer is not charged, because I'm going to quiz you a little bit now. So, we need to actually define terms here a little bit. So, I want to start by asking you, when people have to ask you to define sin, how would you define it? What is it that you're talking about when you define sin?
Missing the mark. No, I'm playing. I mean, yes, but I wanted to give the canned cliche answer. So it is a breaking of the law. Now, from that point, we need to. There's way more definition, but at its core, before you go into what law means and all that kind of stuff, it's a breaking of the law. Now, what does that look like? The law was given as a code of conduct, as best practices, as a way of life that brings about life, the way that we are called to live. Now, the whole gimmick behind the law is that no person can actually live up to the law, and thus the whole idea behind Jesus. Now, I'm expecting that if you are listening to this, you likely are understanding and following my shorthand. If you are not, you can shoot me an email at joe@buddywalkwithjesus.com. And we can have a conversation, and we can explain these things in way more long form if it's something that you don't understand the jumps that I'm making. But I'm going to keep shorthanding for now. When we break the law, we prioritize our will over God's will, and thus choose a way of life that ultimately does not bring about life, because it's not God's will. Thus, the verses that we have about sin leading to death and all of that.
He used the cliche one at the beginning, which we'll get back to in a minute. But I like the last little bit, especially the way that you laid it out, is the idea of the fact that sin is anything that is going to prevent life from happening.
Yeah. In
the most spiritual sense. Yeah. In many ways, in a physical sense also, which we'll get to in a little bit. But yeah. It's a wanting there to be life, because if we believe that Jesus is the life happening would be Jesus. And so that's a good thing. Typically, the reason that we hear the cliche argument is because that's more of what it means from a Jewish perspective, is you are missing the mark, you have violated God's law. The problem, though, is that when we're talking about it from a perspective of Judaism compared to a perspective of mostly Reformed Western Christianity, the idea of missing the mark is missed. And that's where, if my thing was working, I would be able to throw the hi-hat in. But it's missed because the idea of missing the mark within Judaism is exactly what Joe already said, is that the expectation is that you are not going to be able to actually do everything that the law tells you to do. It is impossible to do this, and so you are going to miss the mark. And so when you sin, you then now need to go about doing what is needed to get yourself pure again. This is part of what we've been talking about on Kingdom on the Road, currently as we've been walking through Leviticus, is what all these different things mean on Fridays. But the other thing that's missed when we start talking Judaism is that not all of the laws and not all of the sins are looked at in the same way. Because if you need to violate the Sabbath law in order to save someone's life, not saving the life is actually considered a more grievous sin than violating the Sabbath. Oppression of other people, even in the name of religious purity, is a violation of a greater sin. But that's not necessarily how we talk about it when we talk about missing the mark from a Western Christianity perspective, where we talk about, well, you missed the mark, and so that means that now you are a sinner and you deserve damnation, and so God's going to come get you unless you do exactly what I say now.
Right. And that's easier to reconcile for the human because of our self-centered perspective of justice and vengeance and revenge and all of those kinds of things. So folks, I have been around enough. You guys have listened to Andrew and I work together for long enough that you guys know that it is not an episode of Misfits, Is It Pagan, or any of the other projects that we work together on if we don't say rest in the story, taking the whole story. So you had drawn a distinction there that I think is very, very important to really show how all of these concepts that we've been talking about kind of interplay with each other. I don't know who needs to know this. And I don't know if anybody that does need to know this would be necessarily listening to us right now. But Christianity is intrinsically tied with Judaism. Yes, with the Jesus of it all, there is a separation. There is a divergence between the two at some point in the theological story. But when you look at the history of Christianity, you have to trace it back to the Jewish roots. And when you start to think about, okay, what about this law? What about this one? What about that one? What happens if somebody breaks the Sabbath? What happens if somebody doesn't, what's the one that everybody goes to? Don't boil a goat in its mother's milk or whatever, like stuff like that. Like what happens? And when you look at the law and you look at what at its core fundamentals, what is God doing there? What is God establishing as a way of life for his people through the law? And then you take that forward and say, what is Jesus teaching? What is Jesus establishing? What is Jesus contextualizing? And you understand, well, wait a minute, there's a continuity. And there's a reason why Jesus says, I did not come to abolish the law. I came to fulfill the law. But you don't get there without understanding the Jewish roots of Christianity. You don't get there without understanding that there has to be a level of nuance when establishing all of these different barometers and trying to put your pins in these different where you're going to set them in the different topics and things like that, and understanding that even back into the Pentateuch, even that far back, you had folks that were not genealogically descended from Abraham choosing to be a part of God's chosen people. That is why in Exodus, post-Egypt, you have this reaffirmation. It is essentially replaying the scene where God says, okay, now's the time where you choose. Now's the time where you say yes or no to whether or not you want to be my chosen people. And that point forward established a new covenant that then came with the commandments, that came with the law, that came with these standards that were there to help build a nation, to help build from the ground up what life would look like for God's chosen people. But if you look at all of the through line, if you look at all of the continuity, you come up with two things. You come up with the fact that God, even playing field, image bearers.
Mm-hmm.
Two, you come up with the fact that God instituted a way of life. Now, mind you, that there's wild differences between the Old Testament, the New Testament, even between specifically the time period of the Old Testament and the time period of the New Testament. We don't even need to compare against modern day. We can just compare against those two time periods. That wild differences. But God established a baseline of, okay, this is what you got to do. But if you can't afford to do this, then do this. But if you can't afford to do that, then do that.
And that's
making it accessible to everybody involved, thus establishing a baseline of reconciliation, a baseline of a reachable means of repentance before you even get to the Jesus of it all, before you even get to the Holy Spirit of it all. This is already baked into the character and heart of God. And that, you notice how we're still talking. We started this thing off. What are we talking about? We're talking about sin. There has to be, this is where already the conversation has a means of getting off the rails when you are in the seat of people like Andrew and I, because we do things like read Matthew 18. We do things like talk about sin, or talk about how we cooperate with folks that do not live the same lifestyle that we do, or do not adhere to the same habits or systems or whatever. And we talk about things like reconciliation, like peace and love and things like that. Well, what about what we have to do as Christians? What about treating people as if they're unbelievers, if they're not listening? You know what I'm saying? You already have lost the people who are looking for the big stick because you're not leading with the big stick.
Yeah, we'll come back to that part in a minute, because the first thing that you talked about was this idea of, Imago Dei, level playing field. And this is part of what we talked about on Kingdom on the Road back the last time as we're recording this, when I was on, we were in 4 through 6 of Leviticus. Because that's where God prescribes, this is what you must do to offer up offerings to me. And one of the things that Ant and I found as we were reading through it that we hadn't seen before was that the wording that God uses to describe the people throughout this whole thing. Like Joe said, they have different, there are multiple options for sacrifice based off of what you are able to give, which is awesome. And is something we need to remember, especially those of us that are in leadership positions within our churches, that if you want to claim tithing is still a Christian principle, go ahead, but then make sure you actually know what tithing is, which is another, that's another, we're going to have that conversation. Joe and I already are planning on having that conversation, just not today. Now,
you just ran past that beehive, just kicked that thing and then just kept on running. Okay,
yes,
cool.
Yes, and I kicked it in a very specific direction. Now, But the other part that we saw there is that the way that it is worded when you look at the text, when you rest in the story, is that the people that are coming with the offering are not labeled as the offender. They are not labeled as the sinner. They are not labeled as this person or that person, are labeled by what they're presenting. Everybody, including the village leaders, including Moses, including Aaron, including the priests, everybody that comes with an offering, is blanket statement as they are the offerer.
Yep.
That's a huge deal.
Yeah.
Like, that is a huge, huge deal. It doesn't matter who you are the offerer, because you are offering something up to God in order to be reconciled to him and to the community at large. Which is the other part of what we said at the beginning, is that part of the issue we have is that the way that we look at sin comes from an individualistic mindset. Everything is based on the individual with the way that Christianity looks at sin. And that's partly because of the fact we understand that salvation is an individual act. Joe's faith will not save you. My faith won't save you. My faith doesn't save my kids. Joe's faith doesn't save his wife. It's an individual act.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole reason we're having this discussion is because, like we said, this sprung out of another discussion on accountability, because accountability is a necessary thing.
Yeah.
Because it is about community, which is, again, part of the Jewish understanding of sin, and why miss the mark is a good explanation for it.
Yeah.
But when we divorce community away from this discussion and make it about individualism, suddenly miss the mark doesn't make any sense. And it's used instead as a way to typically raise us up on the playing field rather than level the playing field so that everybody is there in front of a holy God.
Let me tweak what you said just a little bit. If you are keeping to the accurate definition of missing the mark, then suddenly it doesn't make sense. Because
Right.
And I make that distinction because we see plenty of examples of malformed definitions created to fit exactly the scenario that you are talking about. And that's why we keep going back to the Old Testament of it all, the Jewish history of it all, because without understanding why the law was established, how the law displays the entire, not just the righteous, not just the holy, not just the justice fueled aspects of God, but the entire heart of God. If you miss that, then you have missed part of what Jesus teaches. And part of what, so I want to speak to folks that are of a particular vintage, because I would guess that there is at least some level of this representation within the audience. Maybe you grew up in a situation where you were a part of a youth group, and you did something wrong, or you saw somebody do something wrong, and they were carted in front of the youth group or carted in front of the church. And it's this idea of, you have sinned, you have affected the community, and thus now you need to be brought in front of the community in order to make right for what you did, or some variant thereof. That is in no way, shape, or form what we are talking about.
Right.
That's something entirely different from this whole individualistic versus community-based thought process, because even if you are being brought in front of other people, it is still an individualistic perspective is still based out of you have polluted the waters, you risk destroying the ecosystem here, and thus you need to be brought in front of everybody to tell what you have done. It is this whole idea of public ministry, public bloodletting. It's in a lot of different versions thereof. It's still rooted in fear and control and anger and all of those kinds of things that are more human elements than they are elements of the fruit of the Spirit, or driven by Holy Spirit, or with a desire for reconciliation and peace and all of that. But unfortunately, institutionalized, we are now at a point where there is a generation of us that are standing in opposition. I'm not saying that we're the first. I'm not saying any of that. But by and large, there is a generational shift taking place that we kind of, I really want to believe, and maybe this is some of my rare optimism coming out, that our generation cracked the door open, and the generation that's coming behind us is kicking that thing wide open and not taking anything that is being shoved down their throat. That we have been institutionalized to think that we need to run around calling out the sin in other people and calling people unbelievers if they don't change into what we think they should change into, run with our convictions and things like that. And there's a huge, that is an aspect of the modern climate that we still see very, very prevalent. And I think sometimes there are folks that want to believe that when we describe some of the ways of the modern element, that, oh yeah, that was how Puritans acted, right? That was how the ancient, the far back, they were the ones that were burning people at the stake. They're the ones that were doing all that kind of stuff. But yeah, we may have laws to protect against burning people at the stake nowadays, but at an emotional level, at a spiritual level, at a heart level, are we really trying to reconcile people from God or to God, or are we trying to protect the ecosystem from the godless heathens?
Mm-hmm. I think the slip of the tongue you had there, I think actually was correct, is that we are trying to reconcile people away from God.
Yeah.
This is what, so those of you that may have seen it, we released a blog a few weeks ago dealing with the idea of the fact that it seems like we have misunderstood three things. Misunderstood who Jesus is, misunderstood what Jesus as the Messiah actually means, and what both of those have to do with how we view the role of Scripture. And this is exactly what, and it was based out of Isaiah chapter 2 and Micah 4, which both say the exact same thing with like one word changed. And it's the prophecy about how the Messiah, when he comes, will turn your swords into plowshares.
Yeah.
And the entire point was that the Messiah, when he comes, will make war irrelevant.
Yeah.
Because he will arbitrate peace between everyone, because everyone will be at peace with him. Mm-hmm. And when they're at peace with him, there will be no more conflict between anyone else.
Right.
And part of what we put out in that blog, though, is the fact that what we are seeing as far as what is being defined, as far as what the secular culture views the Bible, or even views Christians using the Bible as, is that they are wielding the sword of the Spirit as a weapon of war, rather than as a sword that has been made into a plow to get the fields ready for the harvest that Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 9.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're looking at things as an us versus them. This is the same conversation we've had multiple other times. That a lot of times when we get into the sin conversation, or even how we are supposed to treat unbelievers out of Matthew 18, or all these other things, it is an us versus them category that completely breaks away from the fact that if we believe that Jesus is the one that reconciled us to God, why do we continue to act as if our job is to keep other people from reconciling both with us and with our God as well?
Right. So I'm gonna go to Paul for a second. Paul makes a lot of analogies about sports, about training, about athleticism, and things like that. Now, unfortunately, in the wrong hands, that's where you get the groundwork for a lot of the games of Camus Mus Macho that happen between Christian men. That in order to be a real Christian man, that you got to be an athlete, and you got to be strong, and you got to go to the gym all the time, and all this kind of stuff. That dovetails into all of these different side things. Put away childish things, and all of this kind of stuff. But in saying what I've just said, I can't ignore what Paul said, that Paul used those analogies, and he did so for a reason. Now,
and if you want to learn how to use them right, csrm.org. Beautiful.
Cheap plug. You even do it on your own show. That was impressive that you even found a cheap plug on your own show. So there's this mentality that has to take place when you are an athlete. And I'm not going to tell you for exactly how long that I've been an athlete, because I don't want to admit to my vintage. But I have been an athlete since I was 16 in some form or fashion. And there's a mentality thing that takes place. I was forced into early retirement from the one form of athletics that I was doing because of an injury, and I couldn't accept it. The reptilian part of my brain just would not. It kept asking the question, what if I did it? What if we did it one more time? If I had run one more run left in me, all of this kind of stuff. And so I started, seeing doctors and so on and so forth. But it's that part of your brain that kicks in whenever you're training that says, I don't care whether or not I want to or not. I know I need to. I know that if this is something that I believe in, if this is something that I want to see start to take shape in my life, then I need to train my body into submission. I have been very vocal about the fact that I think running is of the devil. I think it is pagan. Running is pagan. TLDR, running is pagan. But I do it because it's good. Like I need to do it. I hate doing it, but I train myself on how to do it. That's when we look at the way that Paul conceived of it, I would argue that Peter and Paul are two of the guys that show us in the most plain text within the biblical canon of how to adopt high theology and these deep resonant practices into the everyday life, into just some person, and how they can internalize these things and take these principles and things like that. But part of understanding how you get there is understanding the full breadth of what you're doing, understanding the full breadth of who Jesus is, understanding the full breadth of what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. In all of those things that you were describing, there is a reliance on understanding the context of those concepts, of those principles, different things like that.
And that's what what the things you were describing, the most explicit example, and this is part of why those, again, CSRM, what we use a lot of, is one of the most explicit examples of proper sports ministry imagery out of the Bible is out of 1 Corinthians 9, which is Paul, where he lists boxing, he lists running, and he lists all these things as far as how to compete well and how that applies to discipleship. But the bigger thing is that is at the end of a much bigger portion, which actually we were eventually going to get to anyway. Because in 1 Corinthians, Paul actually lays out how we should actually be having this conversation about sin, as far as what it means for us as believers, both from a personal standpoint and a community standpoint and a external community standpoint, as far as evangelism and disciple making, and as far as reconciliation and relationships and everything else. Because if you look at 1 Corinthians 6, all the way up to the end of 9, you see exactly what we have been talking about. The idea of what accountability looks like for the church, and what accountability looks like as far as how do we go about living in a pagan society. It talks about how to have community as a church while also still having community with those outside of it. Mm-hmm. And the big piece out of 1 Corinthians 6, and this is where we're going to actually start talking the concepts a little bit more, because we've given very concrete or even sometimes not unconcrete definitions of sin. Mm-hmm. But I think we need to actually dive into what the concept of sin actually is, as far as what it is that we see Jesus actually rescuing us from. Is what we see in 1 Corinthians 6, where Paul says everything is permissible.
Yeah.
But not everything is advantageous. That is actually what a post-cross view of sin should actually be looking like. Because if everything is not permissible, you're saying sin still has its power.
Yep.
Plain and simple. This is part of, again, why we are saying the fact that what this really shows a lot of the times is where the base of your theology is at. Is it still of fear of sin and death and Satan? Mm-hmm. Or is it in a trusting that I have been reconciled to the Creator that created a perfect world and is now inviting me back into it? Which one of these things are we actually at? Go ahead.
And that's baked into that is this idea of the present and the not yet.
Mm-hmm.
The present kingdom and the kingdom not yet come. When you realize the level of interaction that we get to have in the current with God before everything, all separation, every single form of separation is gone. And the taste of that we get here, that changes everything.
Mm-hmm.
See, here's the thing. And this is probably one of the more fascinating things that I see as far as guys like us, what we have to contend with. One of the things, like I said, we get told we're soft on sin, right? We're theologically liberal and all of this kind of stuff. Well, if you actually sat down and had an in-depth conversation with Andrew and I about all of those key topics that people would associate with whether that distinguish whether or not you're theologically conservative or theologically liberal, many of those things you will find that theologically we're pretty conservative. It's things that center around stances It's things that center around prioritizing one version of sin or one version of taking your will away from God's will. That those are the things that we don't agree with culture on, and thus those are the things that tend to get us labeled as being theologically liberal. And when you look at this idea of being righteous, right? And this whole idea of doing the things that you should be doing. There's a reason why humans struggle with that. Because humans try to do it of their own power, of their own volition, of their own desire. Now, mind you, humans are terrible at that, in no uncertain terms. Humans are terrible at sticking to actual conviction. Hence, the whole idea behind the indwelling of Holy Spirit. But the problem is in order to get to the stuff that actually matters, the stuff that actually shapes, informs theology, shapes, informs relationships, shapes, informs your context within community and all of that kind of stuff, then we have to make room for being able to go there. But the problem is your stances, your opinions, they block that runway. They make it so that way you cannot actually get there and you cannot actually investigate truth. I'm not even saying lay down your mode of thought for my mode of thought. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is if you are authentically seeking truth, the truth of all of this, then you need to lay your preconceived notions on the table. Some of them you may pick back up. There are some preconceived notions that you have that weren't incorrect. Maybe they need to be tweaked or formed. We all need that. But there may be some thoughts that you have that you're like, oh, okay, I've thought through this thing. I've processed through this thing. And now, okay, some of this stuff needs to stay and go away. And some of this stuff needs to be picked back up and I'm good. So it's not all a complete and total 180. You need to, but most of the time, humans being given to nonsense on the reg, we generally need to discard more than we keep. When I look at the entire breadth of the theological shifts that have happened in my life over the last 6 years, I can count on one hand how many have stayed, how many I feel like I walked in with, and a broken watch is right twice a day. You know what I mean? Every once in a while, a blind squirrel finds a nut sort of thing. You find these things like, okay, yeah, cool. I happen to have the right idea about that thing. But how that's contextualized and the larger picture that's contextualized into changed, widespread difference. And I say all of that to say, come join the party. Like, we're not trying to condemn you if you are somebody who says, I need to rethink this. I think we all need to understand that we need to rethink this, and then when we make a shift, probably need to retool and things like that. Because there are, especially for those of you guys that are given to social media and all of that, understand that when you are reading somebody's Twitter post, when you are reading somebody who's particularly hardcore or particularly definitive or something like that, that probably came from something. Somebody got hurt somewhere. Somebody they love got hurt somewhere. Church abuse, physical abuse, spiritual abuse, so on, so forth, so on. There are things that led to, okay, I've seen how bad this is. I've figured out this thing over here. So now I'm going to jump right over into this thing. I did it with Jesus versus religion. There's a whole spoken word piece about Jesus versus religion. And dude, I was bought in, sold out. I love that thing because I found it in the midst of 2020. I found it in the midst of the American Christian church falling directly on its face. I found it at exactly the right time. I was pissed off at the world. I hated everybody, and I said what I said. I mean, I had a level of hatred in my heart for other Christians because of what I was seeing. And so to hear that was like somebody like saying like, oh, finally somebody understands and can put lyrics to how I'm feeling and things like that. And yeah, I'm still in a lot of ways one of the more anti-establishment folks that you're going to find here. The running joke, and it's not really a joke, is that Andrew keeps me around because I make dude look like a moderate. You know what I mean? Like that. I understand that I am not short on opinions and I am not short on passion, but that idea of Jesus versus religion, that idea of how do we cooperate, that idea of what does it mean to actually love others, love God, and all of that kind of stuff has to also be taken with nuance. And that's why we kind of backdoored into whether or not this thing's pagan. Well, it's not whether or not sin is pagan. It's whether or not loving your neighbor is pagan. Loving the unbeliever is pagan. Using other people's pronouns is pagan. Having women in leadership is pagan. Whether or not this whole idea of kicking people out of the church because they don't conform to your mode of life is pagan. The thing that drives me nuts about the whole thing is there are many aspects of this. I'll go back to, and I'll tip my hand right out on the table. I keep going back to the youth group thing because I watched it. It didn't happen to me, but I did watch a young lady who got pregnant, be carted in front of everybody, twice, once at the youth group, once at the church, like the church-wide, carted in front of everybody, and this is how they sinned, and this is how it affected the. And that idea of your sin can affect the community is very, very real. And that's why we are given a context of how to address that. But within that context, we go back to the idea of what is your motivating factor?
Yeah.
What is it love and communication and reconciliation, or is it I am called to be God's sheriff here on earth, and I'm going to run around with my 6-shooter and say, if you don't conform, I'll say it like this, and run around saying conform or die.
Yep. And, the key thing that you identified is actually what we need to end with as far as how we actually go about practicing this sort of thing, is that the key to everything is permissible but not everything is beneficial is recognizing that the Spirit is the one that makes the determination, not us.
Yep.
And that's in terms of for the community and for us as individuals. The Spirit is the one that makes the determination and not us. Right. And this is part of why this goes back to the renewing of the mind sort of thing, is that in order to get to that point of being able to recognize that fact, we have to be humble enough to allow the Spirit to do it. Like Joe said, there are things that he has laid down that the Spirit then told him to pick back up. But there are other things that he laid back down and he's not touched again. Not because he necessarily was in the wrong for having those opinions or anything like that, but because the Spirit has shown him that those are not beneficial. They're not beneficial to him. They're not beneficial to the community. They're not beneficial to the kingdom. Leave them aside. And that may look different for different people.
Yeah.
This is part of where the discussion, part of the discussion that comes up, especially around the idea of homosexuality and everything else. The assumption is that homosexuality is just a blanket thing. And that since it's a blanket thing, this is where the pronouns thing and everything else comes in. Anything that Christians deal with it at all have to be complete rejection, or you are now in sin yourself. But yet we ignore Christians that are also homosexual that are showing the fruits of the Spirit.
Yep.
Why are we now denying the fruits of the Spirit in other people, and in doing so, not showing the fruits of the Spirit in ourselves, and then claiming that the sin is coming from this label rather than a denial of the fruit of the Spirit, or the submitting of ourselves so that we do not ourselves give in to the spirits of the flesh?
Yeah. So
what is it that is beneficial? What is it that is harmful?
Right. There are two things that I think are very pertinent to bring up here. The first is, you had mentioned things that I've set down, and some things that I have picked back up. Now, some of those things that I picked back up needed to change. Even though I picked them back up, they still needed to change. And I'm going to give an example. One of the tenets that made that was so very, very prevalent in the early days of Buddy Walk, in the early days of hearing me proto preach, all of that kind of stuff, is this idea of OSAS. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. For those of you that don't otherwise know, Buddy Walk with Jesus, the ministry, has been around. We were podcasting before podcasting became cool in 2020.
Before you even get into that, define, for those that don't know, OSAS is once saved, always saved.
Yeah, I'm getting back. I'm getting back there.
That we need to define also.
Yeah, hang on. Ashped. Before it became what it is now, Buddy Walk with Jesus was a two-man show. Myself and a dude that I have to give credit to, it took a lot of punches from me. But me questioning his spirituality, questioning his faith, questioning Christianity, questioning everything, and he just heard it and he took it. And it was not it was very rarely respectful when I did it, but he just endured. And so even though he and I don't really do business together anymore, I got to give him a lot of credit for being willing to deal with me, and all of that. But all of those early days, that's all still out there for people to see, because the desire is that people can see that as a pastor now, I came from someplace. Theologically, I came from someplace. I didn't just start off fully formed and all this thought and all this stuff. There was a lot of bad theology that needed to fall off along the way and get pruned and all of that kind of stuff. So all that stuff is still there for you to listen to. But OSAS, once saved, always saved, is this idea that once you pray the prayer, you're good. You're done. That's it. Like, there's nothing that you can do from that point forward to mess up your way out of salvation. And it was the only way that the idea of an all-knowing creator God and this Jesus dude and all of this kind of stuff and all of the evil that I had seen in the world and all of that, because again, didn't grow up in church, the way any of that could make sense was exactly through that, and to the point where most people who would define in terms of isms would have called me an Arminian, or say that I was given to Arminianism. I I'm not given to the isms, so I may have said that incorrectly, but whatever. This idea of nothing sovereign, everything is free, is nothing but free will. That whole thing, and that idea of you can choose whatever you want and God still has you. Now, I needed to lay that down because I needed to say, okay, so let's extrapolate out the thought process. If that's true, if I get to live however I want and I'm still good, what does this mean in relation to this other concept of Christ as King, of Jesus being Lord of my life? Because I'm not. I have a particular distaste, and I'll keep it at a certain level when I say a particular distaste for the ritual of it all, for the routine of it all, for the altar call of it all. That's a conversation that we need to have.
We will.
Our altar calls pagan.
Yeah.
But that idea of the ritual dictates I'm good, and now I get to go forward however I live. Now, people ask me now, do you still believe in once saved, always saved? And the answer is yes, but it looks different. Because if there is no distinction in who is Lord over my life, that's not an OSAS problem. You're talking about something that falls outside of the paradigm of once saved, always saved. And it's one of those topics that you need to take that out before you can get down to the brass taxes of, if I seek to live my life as a follower of Christ, all the while screwing things up from time to time, getting things wrong from time to time, putting my foot in my mouth from time to time, getting pissed off from time to time, all of this kind of stuff. And all the while, grace and mercy and love has me. Well, wait a minute. There's that's starting to look a lot like a biblical thing, and not so much about some kind of denominational stance and things like that. And so, yes, but like I said, different. Now, that brings me to number 2. If we have set the parameters at you still have the opportunity to choose things that are separated from God's will, but grace and love and mercy have you, because these are struggles that you are going through. These are struggles and temptations that you are faced with, and all of that. It comes to this other concept of us as Christians and how we view other people that are wrestling with these things. And this is the point where I need to put Andrew over, because he gave me lyrics to something that it's just, you ever hear a thing and it's like, oh yeah, that's a really simplistic way of saying it, but that's it. That hits the nail directly on the head. It's this idea of empathy shifts. We talk about theological shifts. We've talked about that today. But the other thing to take into consideration is empathy shifts. Now, mind you, I, in no way, shape, or form, I'm just going to rattle off a couple, things that I've needed to change in my life. I don't think anybody will be surprised to know there is not an American flag to be found in this house, and there never will be. Things like I grew up in a very militarized family. I grew up on the East Coast, where nationalism is the soup of the day, and all of that. And so there was a point where I'm like, oh, everybody that wants to stand against Christian values, when I'm still wet behind the ears, guys, when I'm still like fresh out the gate trying to figure out what this whole Christianity thing looks like, I'm hearing culture, I'm hearing it's the height of woke becoming redefined into this thing that is a catch-all for anybody who doesn't believe in conservative good Christian values and all this kind of stuff. And this it's at the height and fever pitch of Trump mania and all of this kind of stuff. And so words like snowflake would be very readily used, right? The terms like the alphabet mafia would be readily used for me. And this is where somebody can, sometimes you gotta admit to the fact that you're the jerk of the situation, right? Like, and for the actual bit that I didn't just do on this, watch some of my other shows that I'm not holding my tongue for. But sometimes you have to admit to how you've gotten things wrong. So I admit freely to the fact that I've said these things, and through exposure to the Holy Spirit, through exposure to my wife, who taught me how to love and how to and how to care for the individual, and all of that, I've shifted into this. I gradually shifted away from singling these people out and saying, what does it mean to actually love people? Now, for as much crap as I talk about 2020, it also was, okay, if I'm going to be about it, then I've got to do the thing, right? And that means not holding people at an arm's length because they practice a particular lifestyle that I don't agree with. So what does that look like? And starting to develop, okay, and now suddenly this dude who used to be like wild now about the whole pronouns and God doesn't make mistakes and all this stuff. Now suddenly I've got members of the LGBTQ plus community on my couch looking for counsel from my wife and I. I've got folks within the house church that I help plant that identify as a different gender than they were born as, and all of that stuff. And suddenly, like, it's a whole world view lesson that I'm trying to like what are these terms and what is this and what is that, and I'm learning. And suddenly I realize, if somebody says to me, I prefer that you use they, them, he, his, her, that, like, whatever. I prefer you use this pronoun versus that pronoun. I had to ask the question, okay, so if I do that, does that mean that I am somehow offending God? And then that got fuel on the fire when I did the deep dive into into the word porneia, specifically during my time in Matthew, and Matthew 5-7. And that blew the doors wide open. Because, guys, let's be honest, have we all always been willing to give over our cell phones to have somebody take a look at our search history? I'm just saying that and the whole LGBTQ plus thing. If we're looking at this, I'm talking to you, conservative Christians. I'm talking to you guys that think that are standing on the shoulders of Scripture, that are saying, I want to keep this 100 when it comes to relation to Scripture. Then study that word. Study that word and understand everybody that Jesus is addressing in that moment, and understand, oh, there's 52 flavors of nonsense. Always has been, always will be. There will always be, like, when it comes to sin, it's Burger King up in here. You can have it your way. You seriously. Just because somebody else's flavor of sin or desire or lifestyle, I'm not just saying sin. I'm take these words, like, these are all words that apply to this situation. Whatever that is, just because somebody else's flavor of that looks different than your flavor of that, doesn't mean that there's a distinction of that's worse than yours. Because I'm going to say this and get things spicy here for a second. If you are, and mind you, if you have little misfits running around that are within earshot and all of that kind of stuff, just fair warning.
It'd be mini misfits.
Many misfits, whatever. If you look at heterosexual porn, it is no different than looking at homosexual porn. There is no difference. A manipulation of that mode of thought, or that code of conduct, or that way of being, or that principle that's contained within Scripture, a manipulation of it is a manipulation of it. It doesn't matter what flavor of manipulation it is. And so all the while, as these things are developing, and I'm realizing that yes, OSAS is real, but for an entirely different reason. And the reality of the continuity of God, and the reality of grace and love and mercy and things like that. And this idea of God always being positioned for us, for our best interest, even when we are quote unquote missing the mark, even when we are messing things up, still being for us, then that empathetical shift takes place of viewing the person first and the activity second. Mm-hmm. Now, yes, I have walked with people in a relational context and have had to have awkward conversations, but that's out of a relational context. That's out of relationship. That's out of something that is caring and loving, not trying to point out the particular sin in a person's life.
And that's, I think, another way of saying all of that would be, if when you hold to OSAS, what is your focus? Yep. Are you grounding it out of a Romans 8 idea of nothing can separate us? Or are you grounding it in a 2 Corinthians 12 of my grace is sufficient for you?
Right.
Both of those things are true. Both of those things are true, but if you are going to emphasize one over the other, which one is it? Is it that nothing can separate us from God because we're just good now? Mm-hmm. Or is it that God's grace is sufficient? Yeah. Which means that if me having to love someone makes people think that I now support something they see to be sinful, is God's grace sufficient?
Right.
Which one is it? Are we fearful of the way that the world is going to view us? Or are we saying that even if I fall trying to do what God has asked, God's grace is sufficient for me?
Yeah.
This is what the Jewish understanding of sin actually looks like out of the Old Testament. Is that if I have to violate the Sabbath in order to save someone's life, I will violate the Sabbath and I will offer up my sacrifice later.
Yeah.
If I have to violate the Sabbath in order to flee temptation, then I will offer up my sacrifice later. Because the heart of the matter is what actually is at stake, which is what Jesus says in Matthew 5. You think murder is bad? Well, I'll tell you what, if you hate the person in your heart, you have already sinned against them.
Yep.
That's what the law has always been when it has actually been understood in the context of what the Messiah was actually supposed to do.
Right.
And now we've gone full circle within a lot of the way that Christianity talks about this stuff, to where now we are saying that sin is this because we're not 100% sure whether or not Christ, the Messiah, actually did all of this. Has he actually died once for all sin so that all might be reconciled? and his grace is sufficient for us so that now nothing can separate us? Or is it that we are now back to, if I don't do this, God is going to strike me down?
Right.
That is the problem we have with the way that we talk about sin oftentimes within a theological culture that is fear-driven and not Christocentric or kingdom-driven.
Right.
That is where we are actually at. It's not about being soft on sin. It's about leaning into the grace of God and understanding that the Spirit is the one that convicts and draws people to Christ and is the one that calls us to righteousness and renews our mind. It's not us.
Right.
Our call is to love God and love other people. And by doing that, we will allow the Spirit to convict those that he needs to convict.
Yep. That's it.
So this was a different version of Is It Pagan?
Yep.
The non-holiday special. So if you want more of Is It Pagan, you can go to either the Buddy Walk or Misfits channels. I think both on YouTube. I think both of us have playlists up for that. There will be its own special page up once we get the network site up. This is just one of many network shows that have a variety of hosts. Some of the other collaborative ones, Friday mornings at 9:30 a.m. Eastern, on all of the Misfits, all of the Buddy Walk, all of the some of the personal channels as well for me, Joe and Ant. You can catch us live Fridays walking through demystifying the Old Testament, doing some of the stuff we did today. Some of the stuff we already did. Some of it we're getting ready to do as we're currently in Leviticus. On Saturday mornings, you can catch more of Joe and Ant and Pastor TC and Rico and occasionally Tiara and all sorts of other guests. Let It Rip, walking through some different things Saturdays at 9:30 a.m. Eastern, live on all the same channels. Buddy Walk wise, he's still going through the Acts project. Do you know where you're at currently?
I just wrapped up chapter 5.
Just wrapped up chapter 5. So he's working his way through it. Again, buddywalkwithjesus.com or all of the links can be found in Joe's on like everything. You can also find out all the Misfit stuff, ministermisfits.com, all the normal links, all the normal good stuff there. The Is It Pagan, I believe, does have a page up on the Misfits site already where you can catch all of our holiday specials and all of our other specials we do as well. We do have the Bible study still going on, patreon.com/ministermisfits, walking through the book of Daniel. We're a few weeks behind, depending on when you're listening to this, due to some scheduling issues, different things like that, internet problems, all that good stuff. But we will be finishing the book of Daniel here soon, hopefully. Joe, you got anything else?
No, I think you got it covered.
Awesome. So, yeah, Misfits, we'll see you next week. Buddy Walk, folks, we'll see you next week. Is It Pagan, people? You never know when we're going to show up. So we'll see you when we see you.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/ministrymisfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/ministrymisfits.